Hello dear students. As we are now moving into the discussions of metabolism of different types of molecules, we have already studied the discussion of the details of the chemistry of different types of biomolecules, be it carbohydrate, be it lipid, be it protein. Sorry. Now we are moving towards the metabolism of all these molecules one by one. So we start with the metabolism of carbohydrates. Before we enter into the different pathways and different reactions of carbohydrate metabolism, in today's class, very briefly we will try to discuss how the carbohydrates in our diet are first digested and absorbed into the body, and then only they will reach different tissues, different cells, and then will be metabolized differently. So this is an essential thing to understand before we enter into the metabolic pathways per se. Okay. So what are the different forms in which carbohydrates are present in our diet? As you all know, they are mainly different homopolysaccharides, that is starch, glycogen, etc. And then different disaccharides that we eat like lactose, sucrose, maltose, etc. Sometimes monosaccharides like glucose we can also take from some sources. And then there is another very important thing, that is dietary fiber, that also we know has some specific important roles. Although the dietary fiber is not digested and absorbed, and that is their mainly physiological role, but that we will not discuss today. Now the carbohydrates that we get in our diet, they are mainly used as a source of energy. You know, the main energy source in our body in most of the cells is glucose, with some exceptions. Now it is the primary energy source, and the major source for such glucose is the dietary carbohydrates, that is starch and some amount of glycogen from animal source, and then different sugars. When I say sugars, I mean the different types of sucrose, etc. Okay. So what happens with the digestion of the carbohydrates is that they are finally digested and broken down in our intestine into their corresponding monosaccharides, like mainly these three, that is glucose, fructose and galactose. These three are the main monosaccharides that produce all the different types of dietary carbohydrates that we eat, and therefore when they are broken down, they are basically broken down into these monosaccharides, and then in that form they are absorbed from our small intestine. And there are many factors that can influence, that can regulate, or that can have some effect on the digestion and absorption of our carbohydrates, some of which we will discuss today, and others we will discuss as we go on with the discussion of metabolism of carbohydrates. So the digestion starts in the oral cavity itself. We are not going to discuss too much detail of the carbohydrate digestion, because I think in physiology itself the digestion processes are again discussed. So the basic digestive steps or processes we will only mention. So as we have said, starch is the main source of carbohydrate, or glucose in our case. So we are mainly focusing on the digestion of starch. So there is an enzyme, that is salivary amylase. Amylase, you know, is the enzyme that breaks down starch. Amylase is the enzyme that breaks the alpha-1,4 glycosidic bonds. These are the alpha-1,4 glycosidic bonds that are broken down by the salivary amylase. So salivary amylase breaks these alpha-1,4 glycosidic bonds that are joining the constituent glucose molecules. So glucose one after another are joined through the alpha-1,4 glycosidic bonds in starch, and then branch points of alpha-1,6, but that's besides the point. But these main chains, all of these are joined through alpha-1,4 glycosidic bonds, and they are broken down by salivary amylase. Amylase have two types. One is salivary, that is produced by the salivary glands, and the second one obviously is from pancreas. Now, when it breaks, it does not break all the bonds. Salivary amylase breaks some of the bonds, some of the alpha 1,4 bonds, and as a result, what is produced? Shorter polysaccharides, or some cases short oligosaccharide chains. Oligo, you know, up to 10 usually we call that oligosaccharide, up to 10 units if there are. So short polysaccharides or oligosaccharides are formed, and sometimes as small as 2 glucose joined together. That 2 glucose unit is maltose, obviously, by alpha 1,4 glycosidic bond. So as small as up to maltose can be produced by salivary amylase, but not free glucose up to that is produced. Usually short oligosaccharide chains and maybe up to maltose. This is the function of amylase, but the food remains for a very little amount of time in the oral cavity. So salivary amylase actually does not work too much, does not get too much time to work. Before that it goes to stomach where the pH is very low, and at that low pH salivary amylase cannot act. So the actual or most important or the major breakdown of starch occurs in the small intestine. When it reaches the small intestine, again the pH rises, and then the pancreatic amylase, that is secreted from exocrine pancreas, that comes into the small intestine, and that amylase now breaks down the starch mainly. Salivary amylase also, although theoretically can break it, but it has a very minor role because it gets very little time. So it is pancreatic amylase which is main. Now again the function is same, the reaction they catalyze are same. The pancreatic amylase also will break these alpha 1,4 glycosidic bonds and will produce short polysaccharides or short oligosaccharides and as small as maltose. So mainly as small as up to maltose can be produced by the pancreatic amylase. So now what we have, from the large homopolysaccharides we have produced as small as disaccharide maltose. Now other than maltose, what else we have? We have two other very important disaccharides that are directly we have obtained from our diet. One is sucrose, which is present in the common cane sugar or the table sugar that we eat, and then lactose, which comes from milk or milk products. Okay, milk products like if you take curd or if you take say cottage cheese, etc. From there you get lactose, or sweets that we take from lactose. So now how these disaccharides are finally metabolized to produce the different monosaccharides. So for the three major disaccharides that are coming or produced through digestion in our diet, in our intestine, are maltose, lactose and glucose. So to break them down, there are three specific enzymes, disaccharide breaking enzymes. All three are hydrolase enzyme, obviously, break the bond by use of water. So these three are maltase, lactase and sucrase. So maltose is broken down by maltase, lactose broken down by lactase and sucrose by sucrase. And their constituent monosaccharides are produced. That is maltose broken down to 2 molecules of glucose, lactose broken down to glucose and galactose, and the sucrose is broken down by sucrase to glucose and fructose. Now that the monosaccharides are produced, these monosaccharides will be individually absorbed. So this part up to this is the digestion, and once the digestion is completed, all the constituent monosaccharides are formed. Then in the monosaccharide form they will be absorbed. Okay. So these enzymes, as you can see, all these enzymes are synthesized by intestinal enterocyte cells, and they are very important for final digestion of the dietary carbohydrates. But there is one very important clinical condition related to these enzymes, specifically one of these enzymes, that is lactase. So, and that is also for exam purpose very important, because it is related to a disease that we are now going to discuss, that is lactose intolerance. From the name itself we can understand that the individual is intolerant or cannot digest lactose. Why? For obvious reason, there is deficient activity of the enzyme lactase. Lactase cannot work properly. So why there is not, or why there is improper activity, deficient activity of lactose? Mainly two causes. One is hereditary. There is genetic deficiency of the lactase enzyme. So if somebody is genetically deficient of this enzyme, obviously that individual will not be able to digest lactose very well. Then there is another very interesting thing, that is acquired deficiency. What is acquired deficiency? This is, lactase enzyme is a highly inducible enzyme. So in enzymes you have learnt a little bit about this. In metabolism, again probably this thing will be discussed, that there are some enzymes which are induced. That is, if there is sufficient amount of substrate present, it will, or some other signals that can induce this synthesis of the enzyme. So lactase is induced by presence of lactose. If there is lactose presence, then lactase enzyme will be synthesized more so that lactose can be metabolized. But if in somebody's diet lactose is absent for a prolonged time, so like in our in infancy, everybody takes lactose because that is present in mother's milk. That is the major source of carbohydrate in an infant. But after your infancy and then childhood, many people in their diet does not take any form of lactose, any form of milk or milk products. So if milk or milk product is absent from diet in somebody's diet for a long time, then there will be no stimulus for lactase enzyme synthesis. So slowly what will happen, over time the level of lactase enzyme will keep on decreasing, and then suddenly that individual takes a load of lactose. If one individual who haven't taken lactose for say 2, 3, 4 years, then suddenly takes something of a milk or milk product which has large amount of lactose, he or she will again show the clinical features of lactose intolerance. Although that also occurs with a background of some amount of genetic deficiency usually, because a subclinical level of genetic deficiency, say there is not much deficiency, otherwise no lactose intolerance. But if that individual does not take lactose for a prolonged time, then the chance of that acquired lactose intolerance over that subclinical level of genetic, say, polymorphism may be more important. But anyway, let's not go there. The two major divisions are hereditary, where mainly the genetic deficiency is the cause, and in those individuals from the very early infancy or childhood, they will not be able to take milk or milk products. The second is acquired, where there is not much of such a genetically low level or low activity of the lactase, but due to not taking lactose for over a prolonged time, the inducible enzyme level goes down, and then he or she may show the clinical features of lactose intolerance. Now, how this lactose intolerance works clinically? What happens? As there is deficiency of the enzyme, lactose cannot get digested. So that undigested lactose, which should have been digested in the small intestine, it is not digested, so it accumulates in the gut. So as it accumulates in the gut, it can draw some amount of water along with it. So it increases the overall volume, and then it reaches the large gut. It is not supposed to reach the large gut. Lactose is not supposed to reach the large gut, because in small gut itself it should have been digested and then absorbed in the small gut also. So since it is not digested, it now reaches the large gut, and we all know what is present in large gut: the gut bacteria, the commensal bacteria of large gut. So they will now digest the undigested lactose. In normal individual, it should not reach up to the gut bacteria, but since it is undigested in small intestine, it goes to the large gut, where the gut bacteria can then break them down. But they do not break them down like our digestive system. So they break them down, partially digest, partially utilize that lactose, and they produce many gases. Gases like carbon dioxide and methane, etc. Also, they produce some short chain acids. So the effect of both these things is short chain acids will draw even more water in the large gut, and that will distend the abdomen, and the gases will also obviously distend the abdomen. So as a result, ultimately the clinical features that we will see will be huge distension of abdomen. Whenever that individual takes lactose, milk or milk product, there will be distension of abdomen, huge distension of abdomen that will lead to a very uncomfortable situation. Then there will be bloating, there will be flatulence, and there may even be severe diarrhea because the short chain acids and lactose itself has drawn a lot amount of water. So distension of abdomen, bloating, flatulence and diarrhea. These are the typical features of lactose intolerance. Okay, so lactose intolerance individual, whenever they take milk or milk product, these are the clinical features that they will mainly suffer from. So just by a diagram, we are trying to just more illustrate what is happening in a normal individual who has lactase, who is lactose tolerant because they have lactase enzyme. Their lactose is supposed to be broken down in small intestine itself and absorbed there itself because they have the lactase enzyme in the small intestine. So lactose does not reach in the, it is not reaching the large intestine. It is not going to the large intestine. On the other hand, if somebody is lactose intolerant because there is no lactase enzyme, then what will happen? This lactose is not metabolized in the small intestine because this lactase enzyme is not present here. So it reaches into the large gut, and then there the bacteria will digest in their own way. They will ferment it and they will produce gas and acids. The acids will draw more and more water, and the water and gas together, they will cause a huge distension of the abdomen leading to flatulence, and obviously there may be abdominal pain and then distension, bloating and diarrhea. So these are the typical features of lactose intolerance. So how do we diagnose lactose intolerance? One is obviously clinically, because whenever that individual takes the lactose, there is we know there is all those typical clinical features. So clinical diagnosis is the first stage. Then lab wise we can also do some diagnostic tests. One is lactose tolerance test. What is it? You give a load of lactose to that person, give some amount of lactose to ingest and see whether the clinical features are being presented or not. Then there is another important thing, that is hydrogen breath test. That is, you give lactose and in that individual's breath you find whether there is hydrogen coming out or not. You take the exhalation and that you test for presence of hydrogen. It is typically can occur if the lactose that is given, if it is broken down by the intestinal bacteria and produce different gases including hydrogen, which may come out through the breath itself. So these are two clinical diagnostic tests, but usually these are not needed. Mostly the clinical diagnosis or the clinical features are sufficient to diagnose someone, but if you want to confirm, then you can do these diagnostic tests. So how will you treat it? Treat the patient? Obviously the most easy and most important thing is to stop taking lactose. Withdraw lactose from diet. And lactose is not very essential in an adult. You may have no problem without taking lactose. In fact, many of us do not take lactose for a long time. In many culture, many diets, milk or milk product is not very important. So it is not very difficult to withdraw lactose from diet. Okay. Then the stopping lactose is the main treatment, and if you stop lactose, all the clinical features will stop. You don't usually need to do anything else. What else you can do if you want to do something more? Then curd can be taken. Curd, although a milk product, curd contains high amount of lactobacillus, which contains lactase enzyme. So if you take curd, those lactobacillus with their lactase enzyme will digest any lactose present in diet in the small intestine itself. So that can be a treatment. And then there are some lactase producing yeasts. Their preparations, some therapeutic preparations are somewhere available nowadays if needed. So that can be given therapeutically. That yeast will produce the lactase that can digest the lactose if somebody is needed to be given lactose due to some reason, etc. So such preparations can be given, but again I reiterate, the main treatment is most of the lactose intolerant individuals is stop taking lactose. That's it. And the diagnosis is also clinical. The clinical diagnosis is main, and treatment is also mainly stopping of taking lactose. So rather simple, diagnosis and treatment is rather simple, not very complex. So why I have discussed this in very detail? Because lactose intolerance is the most important topic, at least exam wise, if you go for the first prof exam. So it has come many times as short note and different explain whys, etc. So it can be an explain why question, that why there is digestion and flatulence and bloating, abdominal pain and flatulence and bloating and diarrhea in patients of lactose intolerance. So that can be an explain the following sentence or short note on lactose intolerance. So now that we have discussed the digestion, now we go to the absorption of monosaccharides, mainly glucose. So the absorption occurs in the enterocyte cells. Okay, the intestinal enterocyte cells. The main absorption, there are many things, I will come to them one by one, but see here, the main transporter that helps in the absorption of glucose is the SGLT1. As you all know, during the discussion of membrane transport, this have been discussed, that is the sodium dependent glucose transporter. Sodium dependent glucose transporter, which is a secondary active transporter. You know, secondary active. One particular molecule is transported against the concentration gradient, which in this case is glucose, and another is transported down concentration gradient, that is sodium. As glucose is absorbed against concentration gradient, we are accumulating glucose inside the cell. If there is large amount of glucose inside the cell, still whatever dietary glucose is present, that will be absorbed through this SGLT1. So if you have to transport it against the concentration gradient from low to high concentration, then you have to get energy for that. You have to expend energy. Where from you get the energy? By a down gradient transport of sodium. Down gradient transport is like falling of water from high to low altitude. So that will release energy. So down gradient movement of sodium will release energy. That energy will be utilized by against gradient movement of glucose. That is the basic concept of any secondary active transporter. So this is the main absorbing mechanism or transporter for absorption of glucose in intestine, that is sodium dependent glucose transporter. But for this to continue function, you have to continuously maintain a gradient of sodium, because this transport is dependent on the transport of sodium down concentration gradient. So how that is occurring? By a primary active transporter. Primary active means where the movement against concentration gradient, active means against concentration gradient, but here the against concentration gradient movement is occurring directly through energy from ATP breakdown. So this is this sodium potassium ATPase. We all know this is our sodium potassium ATPase. Sodium potassium ATPase. This one, this transporter is our sodium potassium ATPase. So sodium potassium ATPase, as you all know, pumps out 3 sodiums and pumps in 2 potassiums in exchange. So continuously sodium is being pumped out of the enterocyte cell by this primary active transporter. That is why there is a gradient of sodium always present, and that is why that gradient can be used for absorption of glucose. Now once the glucose has been absorbed or has been taken inside the enterocyte cell, now it needs to go to the capillaries or blood, so that through blood it can now go to different organs. For that there is another transporter which is known as GLUT2. GLUT, as you all know, is a facilitated diffusion transporter. Okay, so this GLUT there are different types of GLUT, GLUT1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. So among them it is GLUT2 that is present in this, that is the basolateral side of the enterocyte. This is the luminal side. Through the luminal side, glucose is entering through SGLT1, sodium glucose transporter or sodium dependent glucose transporter, which is a secondary active transporter. And in the basolateral side of the intestine, enterocyte, the glucose is ultimately absorbed into the capillary blood or the bloodstream of the body by a facilitated diffusion, that is GLUT2. So these are the three main transporters that are involved in the glucose transporter. Two directly, that is SGLT1 in the luminal side and GLUT2 on the basolateral side. And then indirectly the SGLT1 is helped by the sodium potassium ATPase. Okay. Then there is another GLUT, that is GLUT5, which is present in the luminal side of the enterocyte. This is a minor pathway for absorption of glucose. It is not very important for glucose absorption, but this is the transporter that helps in the absorption of fructose. The fructose that comes from sucrose. Sucrose, again, we know in our diet, sugar is a very important thing. So the cane sugar, main sugar, the common cane sugar that we take is sucrose, and from that most of us daily take some amount of fructose. So for the absorption of fructose, this GLUT5 helps in the luminal side. The galactose that comes from lactose, they can be absorbed both through the SGLT1 and GLUT5, but again fructose or galactose are minor sources, but mainly the carbohydrate is glucose, and this is absorbed through this mechanism. This is again very important topic. How glucose is absorbed in the intestine is again a very important topic for understanding the absorption and metabolism of glucose, and for exam also. This has been asked in the exam many times. How glucose is absorbed? Describe the process of glucose absorption in the intestine. So these are the three main transporters that you have to mention. That is SGLT1 here, then GLUT2 here, and this one helped by the maintenance of sodium gradient by sodium potassium ATPase. And then a minor pathway, that is GLUT5, very minor for glucose, but mainly for fructose and some amount of galactose absorption. And finally all of these will be absorbed through GLUT2. Okay, so this is again a very important. So now this is how the facilitated diffusion of GLUT works. I think this has been discussed. This as a ping pong mechanism. First it opens where there is high concentration, binds it, changes conformation, and then releases where there is low concentration. And facilitated diffusion obviously from high to low concentration, unlike the active transports. So now that we have finished discussion on digestion and absorption of glucose, there is another very important topic which is related to carbohydrate digestion and nutrition of carbohydrate also. This topic will again be mentioned while we discuss the nutrition, but still I think this is worth mentioning here, that what is glycemic index. There are different foods that contain carbohydrate. They are assigned a glycemic index. So what is glycemic index? It is a measure. This is a measure that we do, a thing that we have built up. This is a measure of any dietary carbohydrate, their ability to raise the blood glucose level. So if you take a carbohydrate source, how quickly it increases the blood glucose level, that gives a measure of their glycemic index. So a measure of any dietary carbohydrate to raise blood glucose level after ingestion in comparison to a reference carbohydrate. So if I say its level of ability of increasing carbohydrate in comparison to whom, so there must be a reference. So here the reference is glucose. So if you take only pure glucose, the level of blood glucose increase will be something. So now you compare all other carbohydrate sources with the level of increase of glucose, blood glucose after ingestion in comparison to if you ingest the pure glucose. Okay, so each carbohydrate will then be given a comparative glycemic index score or GI score. Okay, so in comparison to glucose, they will be given a GI score. and that GI score can have a value between 1 to 100, and pure glucose, which is standard, if you take pure glucose, the level of blood glucose increase, whatever that is given the GI value of 100. Any other food, that will have GI value between 1 to 100 in comparison to glucose. Now lower the GI score of any food, they will raise blood glucose level slower and lower in comparison to foods that have higher GI value. So foods that have low GI value, that do not raise the blood glucose level neither as fast and nor as high as the GI value. This sentence is written a little bit wrongly. So the thing is, two foods, say one has a GI value of 20, another has a 40. So the GI value 20 food will raise the blood glucose level after its ingestion in a much slower rate and at a much lower rate than the GI value food of GI value 40. So that's the basic thing. So which one is better? Obviously it is the low GI score foods are better, since after ingestion they shoot your blood glucose level at a much slower pace and at a much low concentration also. There are many epidemiological as well as clinical studies that has shown that low GI value foods are good for us. They increase the chance of weight loss, they reduce the risk of most of the metabolic diseases like obesity, type 2 diabetes, and as a consequence they reduce the risk of cardiovascular disease also. So it is in any nutritional say prescription, or not prescription but nutritional, any nutrition chart that is been given to anybody, it is always tried to give a preponderance of the low GI food, more amount of low GI food, and trying to avoid high GI food as much as possible. So that is the idea. So finally, depending on GI value, we can divide the food into three groups. One is the low, where the GI value of food is less than 55. If it is 56 to 69, then it is medium GI value, and high GI value is more than 70. If GI value is more than 70, that is high GI value food, and that should be avoided as much as possible. So in this chart, I've given you examples of foods with low, medium and high GI value. Each some examples. There are obviously many other examples. Carbohydrate containing foods are endless. Some examples are given. You can remember one, two, or at least some of them, couple of them. The thing is, this low, medium, high, this division, distinction of foods, this changes from some textbook to other textbook. So if you study one textbook, you may find some of the examples given in low GI in one book, maybe included in medium in another textbook, high in one book, medium in another, medium in one, high in another. So this much change may occur, and some examples, extra examples may be found here and there. That does not much matter, but mostly some of the basic examples, if you can remember, that is okay. Just at least know that low means less than 55, medium 56 to 69, and high GI means more than 70. That's it. Okay, so if you can remember that much, that is okay. And some examples from each of these three groups. So with this, if you can know this much, that is sufficient for understanding the glycemic index. Okay, so this much for today. Thank you.